Hi, and welcome to the KidneyX Artificial Kidney Prize webinar. We'll be starting shortly, just waiting for a few more folks to join. Thank you. Hi to those just joining. Welcome to the KidneyX Artificial Kidney Prize webinar. We'll be starting in a few minutes after a few more folks join. Thanks. Hi everyone, welcome to the KidneyX Artificial Kidney Prize. Our third webinar is on moving from lab to marketplace. We have two excellent panelists for you here today. Really excited to get in and talk to and hear from them from their perspectives. But as some folks are still joining, wanted to give you guys all a brief overview of our webinar today. So first off, my name is Julia Key. I'm an associate at Luminary Labs, which is a strategy and innovation consultancy firm, acting as the prize administrator for this challenge on behalf of the KidneyX team at HHS and ASN. Before we begin, a couple quick introductions to the Zoom features. After hearing from our guests, we will have a live Q&A session at the end of our time. And the Zoom Q&A feature, it should be on the bottom menu, I believe on the right-hand side. You can enter any questions there throughout our time, and we'll try to get to all of them at the end of our session. Additionally, if you do get disconnected from the webinar, you can find the dial-in reference in the email you received from Eventbrite earlier to dial back in. A quick overview of our session today before we dive in to hear from our speakers. First, we'll start with a quick refresher of what KidneyX is and the goals of the Artificial Kidney Prize. And we'll continue with brief introductions from our panelists, Jeff Dunkel and Vineet Nishawan. Next, we'll dive into our fireside chat with those panelists. And finally, we'll finish off the webinar with a live Q&A. And again, you can submit those questions into the Q&A box at the bottom menu bar of your screen. So wanted to give those of you a quick reminder of the goals of the Artificial Kidney Prize, particularly those who may not have joined our previous webinars. That being said, if you're looking for something of a more general overview of the competition that goes in depth onto what you can expect and submission values and all of that, you can, our first webinar, our information session is recorded and posted on our website. We strongly encourage you to check that out, as well as our frequently asked questions page, all of which can be found on our website. That being said, Going back into what our goals are for this competition, we really designed this as a transformational competition to advance entirely new solutions for people with kidney diseases, solutions that would, either radically improve the quality of life for people waiting for a transplant, or maybe even become their lifelong solution. Specifically, across the phases of the competition, we're looking to advance wearable, implantable, bioengineered, xenotransplant, or chimera solutions, or even solutions that aren't yet conceived. We're really open to anything you think that can advance what could be considered an artificial kidney. And these solutions can be, for phase one, components or a building block solution that kind of fits into a bigger solution, or something that's more fully integrated. Additionally, we do know that this will require a broad range of multidisciplinary innovators, which we'll touch on later, to collaboratively develop solutions for replicating kidney function. So we're really striving to bring in cross-disciplinary and multinational innovators who can look at the challenges in creating an artificial kidney from unique perspectives. And so finally, this is all kicking off in phase one, which we're in right now, by seeking both component and integrated solutions, those kind of building blocks versus full system solutions I talked about, with the second phase to follow next year that would emphasize the integration of prototype solutions. And the phase one solutions are due March 24th of this year. So we've got 5 or 6 weeks left of phase one. Really excited to see what everyone's going to submit. So finally, before I introduce our panelists for today, just wanted to reiterate the purpose of today's session. We're really excited to bring in experts from both investment and serial entrepreneurship perspectives, and they'll give you their take on taking ideas and innovations from the lab to the marketplace and all the considerations that have to go with that. And while creating an artificial kidney or a component of one is really complicated, we do believe that it's possible in the near term. And this will require agile and collaborative thinking, especially given the complex nature of kidneys and the general topic area, which is really why I'm so excited and thrilled to introduce our panelists today. So with that, I'd first like to introduce Jeff Dunkel. He's a healthcare strategist, innovation advisor, and he's currently the Chief Strategy Officer of Government Regulatory and Strategic Initiatives at Mindset Medical. Jeff?
Good morning. Give a quick speed dating round on background or
yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, sorry. So my name's Jeff. It's very nice to meet you all. As stated, I am running strategy at Mindset Medical. Currently, it's a really neat company. You'll hear a lot about in the very near future. The ability to extrapolate virtual vitals using things like a phone instead of having to have wearable devices in order to generate clinical meaningful aspects to make telehealth a little closer to being in the office. I have worked as a special advisor or a committee member or a mentor with HHS, the White House, Population Health Initiatives, National Institute of Health, FDA Medical Device Epidemiology group, as well as FDA PREPS task force, and also have written pieces of policy that have gone into congressional and senatorial language. So my expertise is not in designing like all of you, which is very, very exciting for someone like me, but rather knowing the process of taking something from kind of concept on a napkin all the way to successful commercialization.
Great, thank you so much, Jeff. Vineet, I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself as well.
Thank you, Julia, and good morning to everyone. I started my first company as an engineering student many years ago, and subsequently my startups were acquired by companies such as Boeing, Motorola, Qualcomm, Mitel, so aerospace and telecommunications. About 14 years ago, I switched roles from running companies to helping others. And that took two directions. One was teaching at Boston University, which I continue to do. And the second was investing. The teaching led to running the technology licensing office at Boston University. And in 5.5 years, we launched 8 venture-backed companies, raised over $350 million to date. And in the process, I learned life sciences to the extent a electrical engineer can learn life sciences. And now I'm at Mass Ventures, which is the state's venture capital group. founded in 1978 when there were fewer than 20 venture capital firms in the world. Massachusetts has always been a visionary leader in these areas, and now we're focused on investing in deep tech, particularly academic spinouts.
Great. Well, thank you so much, both of you. With that, I think we can launch into our fireside chat today. Give me one moment to close out. So yeah, I wanted to talk to you both a little bit about the broader implications of our competition and advice that you can both impart to our solvers here, who are really looking at very complicated, big picture problems. You know, the Artificial Kidney Prize is seeking to accelerate, like I said, you know, artificial kidney development towards human clinical trials in the next few years. And given the complexity of the kidney, phase one has really been designed to encourage participation from a broad cross-section of innovators. So that could include solvers already working in the kidney health space, as well as those from analogous spaces, kind of out-of-the-box solvers. As well as solvers can be working on integrated systems and the components that support them, and they may hail from academia, as Vineet has a lot of expertise in, or industry, or small business sectors, and it's open to global participation. So, you know, with that all in mind, Vineet, given your experience in that translational innovation, what advice would you give to teams whose work is perhaps outside of the kidney space or in an analogous area?
Yeah, so, I mean, most big innovations are starting to come from the intersections of disciplines. So, you know, at a very kind of, you know, 35,000 foot level, I love the intersection of computing and biology. And it's starting to create all kinds of interesting medical devices, diagnostics, and even therapeutics that are bringing, you know, solutions to unmet needs. In order to do that is bringing people together that would normally not be together, even frankly, if they were in college, because, you know, colleges have become very siloed. And so a data scientist may not really touch a chemist, right, through school. But as these new innovations are coming to market, these groups are coming together. And when those teams come together in a well-functioning way, I think they can create some amazing new ideas. And there are lots of examples of this. The one example that I love, so one of the spin-outs we did from BU is a artificial pancreas company called Beta Bionics. It was an engineering professor at Boston University who was working on something completely unrelated when his son was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And he was determined to come up with a solution that allowed his son to be independent once he left home to go to college. So that was a decade ago. And in that decade, he has single-handedly been able to lead companies like Medtronic and others in a solution, has raised over $100 million in the process. And frankly, it's going to be very successful, and it's going to help a lot of people with type 1 diabetes. So I think that's a story of how a engineering professor sort of learned biology and has come up with a solution that's going to help a lot of patients.
Yeah, that's great. I think you really hit home on another point, is that all of these areas can often touch us on a personal level, and that means that they can even mean so much more and are so important. Jeff, I'm curious, you know, from your perspective, collaboration, you know, as Vineet just said, is so important in unsiloing the siloedness of, you know, universities and different areas of expertise. So what is your advice to teams who are looking to select a partner or trying to figure out, you know what I know, but how do I know what I don't know?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it kind of, just for context, right? You kind of have to back up. I always think you need to start at the end point and then kind of work your way towards the question. So I think what we know is that we have a resounding need for a solution to end-stage renal disease, right? That's better than where we currently sit. And so we have an idea on how that progress works, but we know that different materials are going to interact with the body a different way. We know that there are complexities to glomerular filtration rates. So as you just said, there's two instances where different professionals would need to align in order to make something like an artificial kidney, right? But you also have gene modifiers and impactors to GFRs and batteries and device technicalities and engineering. So I think the answer is that this is incredibly complex. If it was easy to do, it would have been done a long time ago, right? And so what we have to worry about now is not necessarily whether or not we can find one person with the solution, but whether or not we can collaborate as a community to figure out what that solution looks like. And we see that, by the way, in a lot of other arenas, right? So as an example, there's an ongoing HHS project, which I've talked about with some of the individuals that are moderating, where we pulled what is the global impact or public health impact of various disease states, right? And so when you look at, you can look at three things. You can say cost and healthcare and innovation, but then you got to go farther and say direct and indirect cost, right? Healthcare impact could be mortality, disability, patient impact, and then you can go slope regression, disease regression, et cetera. So the point is, you can see how incredibly complex just figuring out what the problem is can be, right? So now you got to say, okay, now that we understand that, how do we get to the solution? And the reality, my experience in working with more than 30 innovative companies over the last decade and working them through these kind of complexity scenarios is there's not many people that have everything in their pocket, right? So I'm excited to see KidneyX encouraging bringing people together, because a lot of times it happens behind the scenes, and that means slower progression and networking instead of pulling in. So for those of you out there with ideas, submit them, right? Let's see if we can become kind of the online dating site for individuals that know what's going on inside our bodies and figure out how to make this thing work.
Yeah, and I might add to that, Julia, that you know, a lot of innovation is about timing, right? And so if you think about kind of all the possible areas of solving the problem Jeff just laid out, it could start with, just like in the artificial pancreas, with a external device that you're wearing, with a sub-Q sensor and a delivery device, right? And the device you're wearing is closing the loop. And it's like any other wearable device, has to have the right battery life and user interface and things like that. You could then imagine that entire device could go sub-Q, right? So it's not visible at all. It could get charged externally, through electromagnetic charging. Then one could, and this doesn't all have to happen serially. Some of this can happen in parallel. You could have a cell and gene therapy solution, right, to sort of replace the missing cells, in the case, the islets, in the case of the pancreas. And eventually, we may have a regenerative solution where we're actually, using stem cells or other ways to regenerate the entire organ or parts of the organ. And so I think the partners that you pick and the way you collaborate are going to depend on which one of these directions you're going in. But one thing for sure you can say is, you want to make sure you have clinical partners. You want to make sure that you have the right science and engineering partners. And I think you want a connection to the patient, either through patient advocacy groups or directly to patients. And, you mentioned earlier that you must have sort of a personal connection when Sarah asked me to come and join this panel, she didn't realize that I have a personal connection to this, other than sort of being in the world of commercializing, these kind of technologies. I'm a kidney donor to my son. So, I've had a 30-year kind of journey and knowledge that a patient experiences in stage, renal disease. And having those kind of people on the team are I think are as important.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vinette. Yeah, I appreciate that. I think ASN in particular and HHS, the KidneyX have really wanted to shine a light even more so on the patient voice, because they are the ones at the end of the day who will be using this, and they're the ones who really understand the ins and out of what daily life is with all of that. I wanted to shift a little bit to maturity and development to talk to you guys about. Phase 1 is early stage in the Artificial Kidney Prize, and it's been designed to welcome participation at really varying levels of maturity, from benchtop designs, animal testing, iterative testing. So, Jeff, as an entrepreneur, you've kind of seen this happen, dozens of times with really great scientific minds. What can innovators do now at these kind of early stages of development to set themselves up for success, later down the line?
Yeah, so I tell almost everyone, you need to kind of walk through the big picture just to understand the big picture, right? We get a sense of losing ourselves in progression, and there's really two phases to this, right? There is the product creation piece, which is kind of pre-market, and that's your patents, your intellectual property, research and development, and that, by the way, has a broad span, right? That's napkin drawing all the way to meaningful, usable product. Regulatory and funding, right? I mean, that's a whole lot of stuff just on the front end. And then as soon as you have a product, now you get the 5 Ps of healthcare kind of knocking you back a little bit, right? So that's in the hierarchy: policy, payers, purchasers, physicians, and patients. And so each one of those has some complexities to it. So your market strategy may then impact how you come into the market, may impact how you file an FDA regulatory submission, whether or not you do something like go for an ICD-10 PCS new technology code, all those different designees. So I always encourage people, and I'm happy to spend a day pro bono working with people to say, let's walk through the progression. What does this look like? What does the end product look like? What are your goals? Now let's back up a little bit and say, where are you now? And the reality is there's not one person that's going to be able to do that all themselves, right? So we grow as a team, we acquire talent as the talent is needed. Guys like Vineet love to hear that, because they don't want you spending money the wrong way, right? Spend it the right way at the right time, though, and you get some real good success. So I always advise, especially for those in the early research phase, right? Focus on your science and technology and your intellectual property, right? Those are the 3 things that you just have to hammer down. Number 2 is stay grounded, right? I've certainly had more than my fair share of successes. I've also had some learnings along the way, right? We have to learn how to get up when we trip and fall. And so, don't start dreaming about the beach house before you've even completed the prototype, right? And then finally, you have to figure out a balance between how to push and when to be patient. And the answer is you should always be pushing, but you have to be respectful that all of those pieces around you may not be ready to complement you yet. Vineet nailed it earlier when he said a lot of this is about alignment at the right time of development of the master project, right? So I think those are kind of the 3 things that I'd really dive into: is science and technology early, stay grounded, and push, and as patiently as you can continue to push.
Yeah, those are really great points. Vineet, wanted to kind of ask you a similar question. At these earlier stages of development, what can make a team or a company idea stand out to you, or make you feel like they're going to be successful in the future?
Yeah, so I'll speak to it from my investor hat, even though I spend more time being an entrepreneur than an investor. But an investor will typically look at 3 things, when they're deciding whether to invest or not. One is the science or technology, obviously, or the product, we may call it that. The second is the market opportunity, and the third is the team. And of course, there's nuances to each of these three depending on the area that they're pursuing. In this case, if we're talking about an unmet need, which is end-stage renal disease, one could say, well, the market's pretty well understood. In reality, it's not, because there's so many different ways to approach it, right? A better, a dialysis machine, a wearable, versus gene or cellular gene therapy. I mean, there's so many different kind of approaches. So in a way, being very clear about your go-to-market strategy, I think is an important component of what I look at for these early stage, science / engineering projects. The second, and of course, Jeff nailed it, getting your intellectual property right, making sure you have data, proof of concept data of any kind, all those things, sort of talk about the science and technology and the go-to-market strategy. The team is also very important to me. And, one of the reasons we were successful at Boston University in launching so many of these spin-outs is that we found, or we matched entrepreneurial champions with the innovators and the scientists. And, I was an entrepreneur. I know how important that person is. And a lot of academic spin-outs depend on serendipity for that business partner. Whereas I felt it had to be much more deterministic, finding the right kind of partner. It's not easy. These are two sides that have very different approaches to problems, and you have to find enough common ground that two sides will come together. And that's something we're doing now at scale here in Massachusetts. It's a program called MassVX that we're bringing entrepreneurial champions together with these academic spin-outs. So really, those are the two key things is just the science and technology backed with data, with the right go-to-market strategy, and a team that's appropriate for this early stage, but should include an entrepreneurial champion.
Vinny, that's a great point. I wanted to ask you kind of what I think, the phrase entrepreneurial champion is so powerful and impactful. I'll ask this to you and maybe Jeff as well, given your experience. So what are those kinds of aspects that make someone a really good champion? Or obviously it'll depend on each different company, but like what are things that solvers can be looking for if they're trying to grow their team and find that champion for themselves?
Was that for me, Julia?
Yeah, let's start with you, Vinny.
Yeah. Well, let's work backwards. So if you're an investor and this team comes to you looking for money, if that team has made you money before, is a very strong likelihood that you're going to write a check to them. Regardless of what the idea technology is, the fact that this team has made you money before, and by the team, I mean, even if it's just the entrepreneurial champion that's made you money. So the first spin out I did from BU, I knew I needed to prove my model out. That's exactly what we did. It was a company called Sample 6. I got a entrepreneur who had previously done an MIT startup and sold it to 3M. He was about to do another MIT startup, got him to come across the river to BU and, meet the PI and the grad student. They got along, he took over. As soon as he did, Flybridge Ventures, who had made money off their last startup, led a $5 million round. I mean, that's the way the world works. So, so that's like the best scenario in an entrepreneurial champion, if you can get one, right? The next best is somebody who's made money for someone, right? And so they're going to get looked at by most investors, right? The next one down is somebody who's done an academic spin out before success maybe hasn't made a lot of money for someone, but was successful enough in getting to a point, and then for whatever reason it failed, right? The technology didn't work out, regulatory didn't happen, whatever, it doesn't matter. Failure is just fine as long as it's explainable. You know? So that would be sort of the pecking order of an entrepreneurial champion. Now, let's be clear, an entrepreneurial champion doesn't have to be just the CEO, right? An entrepreneurial champion could be an executive chairperson, right? Or an entrepreneurial champion could be, in the beginnings, just business development along with the science. And then a CEO comes later. That's why I use the term entrepreneurial champion, because when you use the word CEO, it immediately in people's minds creates hierarchy. And this is something that I say over and over again. These very early stage spin outs and companies, it's a co-equal role between the business entrepreneurial champion person and the science. They have to be co-equal. You know, they can't be hierarchy at this stage because there's a lot of little pivots you have to do, you know, as you go along and evolve the technology and understand its place in the market.
Thank you. Jeff, anything to add to that? I think you've been there before.
Yeah, I mean, Vineet nailed it. Yeah, I'm usually, unfortunately, sitting on the other side of the seat trying to explain the technology to someone like Vineet. But I first of all will mirror success begets success, right? So if I start the conversation by saying, these are the companies that we've led to IPO or public or acquisition, our divestiture, and here's the finances that came, you immediately have someone's attention. But that said, you know, I didn't always have the ability to have that conversation, right? So for for individuals that haven't, don't worry, you'll get your chance. I think the number one thing for someone who hasn't been sitting in that room, trying to look very calm on the surface while freaking out underneath, is, you know, understand the market analysis and the impact, right? So it's one thing to understand your technology, but how is that going to impact the patient? And what is the value of your product? It doesn't have to be 100% right, but know some things, right? You know how many people have diabetes and what the progression is. I mean, these are searches that we can now do with Google, right? Or your favorite web browser, whatever that is, right? You can walk in and at least seem informed, because what an investor is going to think, or what a healthcare strategist or or entrepreneurial champion is, what is this tech and how adaptable is it to whatever the reality is by the time that comes to the market, right? And so that's the big picture context is, be the expert on your product and be extremely knowledgeable about the market, right? Just get very comfortable having conversations as deep or as shallow as someone wants to go. That's number one. Number two is get really good at explaining very complicated things in 3 sentences or less. When you get that piece right, you don't have to get everything out, right? You just get enough out that someone says, whoa, I want to know more, right? And that also creates, instead of a data dump, it creates dialogue. And through dialogue, you then get an understanding on what people are looking for. So that's an important piece, and that's a standard communication. But anytime we get excited about something that we take ownership of, we all have the same tendency, right? Let me just tell you everything I know about it and really hope that something catches. So that's earlier on when we said be push, but also be patient. That's part of that patience piece.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff.
Sure.
Before we head over into our live Q&A, I just wanted to ask you both one more question. We both touched on the market and understanding what that is, and I know neither of you are necessarily kidney experts, but wondering if you guys have seen, what Vineet, you mentioned gaps of understanding of the market, or what are the opportunities and gaps that we're not necessarily seeing, or maybe just not talking as much about. Vineet, maybe I'll hand it over to you first.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, coming from the tech entrepreneurship world, there were 2 things that I was struck with in the life sciences world. One was that in the tech world, um, and this is a broad brush generalization, but it's a deterministic world. When I design a circuit and it works, it's always going to work, right? Because it's governed by the laws of physics and engineering, and coming into the world of human biology, you realize it's a probabilistic world, right? And it really, that's the first thing I had to figure out, that it is not a deterministic world. No matter how much everybody tries to paint it, it's not deterministic. So that was one big kind of understanding for me. The second was the path to market was far longer and riskier in life sciences. We all know that, but sort of understanding that in real time, and that the artificial pancreas project is a classic case where the science and frankly even the engineering were working years ago, and first in animals, as it got proved out in pigs, and then actually it was at a summer camp for type 1 diabetes kids. But it's still not a commercial project, right? So to go from there to a commercial project is torturous, clinical trials, getting approvals for them, having multi-center clinical trials, getting IRB approvals, getting FDA approvals, compiling the data, dealing with, every adverse kind of issue. So really, understanding that that's going to be a long road to do that, and that you're going to have to raise a lot of money to get there, is something I think people have to understand, right? And until you've done a medical device or therapeutic, it's hard to grasp that. I don't know. Did I answer your question, Julia?
Yeah, I think so. And there's a lot of, like you said, market considerations and a lot of steps in between successful lab testing and full commercialization. Jeff, you've kind of done this. Are there lessons learned, or like I said, kind of going back to the market, things that people aren't necessarily thinking about?
Yeah, we can do both, but I'll start with the market and then just remind me on the lessons learned when we get to the end. I had a really nice opportunity as an advisor to the End-Stage Renal Disease Committee at the White House for Population Health, which transitioned the last 3 presidents. So this is not a flash in the pan type thing. And what I've learned over the course of time and engagement and interaction as an outside person that at the time was tasked with bringing new concepts and innovation to that group for visibility was the problem is very complex, right? So the Office of Management and Budget from a White House and National Treasury perspective is very concerned about this disease state, because as soon as you are labeled with end-stage renal disease, you are now deemed to be disabled. And through the quirky language that we have, sometimes quirky language that we have litigiously, that means that you go off the books of a private insurer and immediately fall onto CMS. Now, normally that complicates measures, but in this instance, it actually simplifies things. So the market dynamic that we talked about earlier, where most of my expertise goes, which is taking those products and creating successful commercialization, involves over 275 payers. Each one has on average 10 plus plans. Coming up with a strategy in order to get coverage on a new device for 2,075, so on, chief medical officers and boards is a little bit challenging, but we're only talking about one, right, being CMS. So that's the first piece. The second is the people that have the most to win from a cure have kind of a selfish motivation. So if we can prevent an individual from falling into end-stage renal disease, or if we're good enough and we can see not just disease, a slowing of disease progression, but maybe even a disease regression, right? Maybe we step back in, or even a disease elimination. Does that allow federal funded taxpayer dollars to no longer be allocated towards those people? So I'm saying this because it is that this disease state is just so unique because of the complexities that lie behind in the payer scenarios that really motivate members of Congress and the Senate to push forward. And also, obviously, between HHS, White House, NIH, FDA, AHRQ, right? There are a lot of committees that have a lot of focus on this disease state. So now you kind of have a bigger picture on why, right? There's just a lot riding on it. So that's the scene. Because of that, we have already seen an advancement of innovation hitting. We've already seen just a whole litany of congressional and senatorial bills that have passed with language already written vaguely, right? That allows for payments to be made in innovation in this space without having to take 2 or 3 or 4 years. So when I'm presenting, if I'm presenting in this space to an investor, the ability to get something to market, but not just to market, but over the barriers and hurdles in the market rapidly is majorly attractive, right? So that's the first piece. Second piece, advice, right? On the advice side, I think we have to understand again that even with all those barriers down and with that really nice clear runway to have a product take off, we have not seen as much success as we need to see, especially in a market that has so many dynamics. And so I don't think there's anything that I can encourage that this group doesn't already know through the KidneyX Foundation. I mean, the part of the reason I wanted to jump on this call was not to present brand new ideas. Sometimes that's not what we need to do, but rather encourage collaboration. There was a really good COO that I worked with in my last company, and we sold a surface that was 125.4 millionths of an inch, right? It could touch a cell and make that cell split in ways that were miraculous and grow bone. And so I got to represent that technology. No idea how to make it, right? That's not my job, right? But I got to represent. And we had a saying within that company, instead of a rising tide, which is a cliche, right? A rising tide raises all ships. We used to say, what he used to say, and I picked it up, right? We all look a lot taller when we stand on the shoulders of giants, right? So within this group, if we can create a community that is collaborative, right? The divisive thing has not worked so far, right? So let's get collaboration in and let's everybody come to the table and say, this is what I have, do these pieces fit together? And it may be that we break off in different groups, right? It may be that the puzzle pieces don't all match exactly where they are, but if we do work together, we can solve big problems. And I will tell you, when you have problems that are direct and indirect that lead to trillions, right? That is a huge financial opportunity and win for everybody involved.
Thank you. I think that's a really great answer. And hoping to dive in now a little to our live Q&A session. I think we've had a really great conversation between Vineet and Jeff, and hoping to eke a little bit more out from them with the remainder of the hour. But before we dive into those questions, I just want to quickly introduce representatives from the organizations behind the KidneyX partnership, and they'll help us answer any more technical or logistical questions about the competition. First, we've got Ben Eloff from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Office of the Assistant Secretary of Health, as well as Mark Lim from the American Society of Nephrology. And so they'll be joining us to answer some more questions here. But on that note, Jeff and Vineet, we had a great question from the audience, kind of asking about the difference between invention and innovation, talking about some of there's a lot of struggle between having an idea and getting it to market. And there's, as we talked about, that huge gap in between. And so this attendee asked, what can be done to make a drug or device or other innovation widely available and used, or what's the difference between that like invention style thing and pushing towards innovation? Vineet, maybe I'll push that to you first.
Yeah. So when I took over the tech transfer office at Boston University, first of all, I didn't know anything about patents and commercialization when I did that. And so I kind of approach it with a fresh pair of eyes. The first thing the first question I asked is, we have 300 patents sitting here in inventory. Why haven't they been licensed? And there was not a simple answer. I literally had to go look at every one of them individually And each one of them had a little story associated with it. So I'm not sure there's a simple answer, but if there were, what I would say is that let me put it slightly differently. There are a couple of ways to commercialize something. You know, the most common way is to find a hole in the market because of, you know, what you experience. And this is how, you know, tech entrepreneurship primarily works, right? You find a hole in the market and then you organize resources, people and money, and you build a product and you fill the hole, right? You know, whether that's Instagram or Twitter, these are all kind of holes in the market that people organize around. Academia works the opposite way. People work on technology, on science, right? Without always having a clear understanding of what the market opportunity is going to be. Much harder problem. In fact, I created a class at BU that's specifically about how do you take these technologies and actually see if there's a market for them or not. And it's, as I said, a much harder problem. So, you know, inventions don't necessarily fit into the market, and it could be all kinds of reasons. The timing is not right. You know, market forces such as companies who bring things to the market, you know, may not be interested in something that early. That's why you do a startup. You might not be able to find the right investor, you know, for the startup. So generally, the difference in invention and innovation is whether you found kind of a market, a spot in the market for it. Generalizing.
Yeah, thank you, Vineet. I think that's a really great way to put it, and definitely from someone who's an authority in a professorial manner on the matter. Jeff, anything to add on that, kind of the difference between having an invention versus innovation?
I think people can invent things without them always being innovative, right? So I'll give you an example. Many moons ago, before this beard was filled with gray, although the lighting here is great, it doesn't look as bad as it really is. Before I started having sore knees, I worked in the pharmaceutical world, and you know, it was amazing. Everything wasn't necessarily trying to drive or improve a disease state. It was trying to make sure that we took care of our shareholders in light of also trying to improve disease states. And so if you had a patent that was falling off and something was going to go generic, it was not uncommon for someone to create an S isomer of the exact same, you know, pharmacy that created the benefit in the first place. For example, omeprazole, which is generically Prilosec, right? When it was falling off patent, became esomeprazole. It's an S isomer. It's a mirror image, just flipped around the other way, right? Came onto the market, and with very good marketing was able to take a product that was going generic and maintain that life cycle. That is invention, right? It did not innovate. It did not change the disease state. It did not progress, but it did secure and stabilize that revenue line. Innovation is where you're changing something for in some form or fashion, right? So I'll give the references that are probably more meaningful, which is HHS and NIH, right? So HHS, if you improve the quality of care, right? If you reduce the cost, then you are innovating, right? In some form or fashion. NIH looks at applications and in true innovation through the SBIR division. So for those that aren't familiar, that's, man, I hope I don't butcher this since I mentor for them, small business innovation and research. So you can apply there, and then based on how you are in your progression, right, which could also be the difference between invention and innovation, right? You could invent something and not know how innovative it is until you've developed it, right? You'll see different stages. So phase one may have a very small amount of money associated, and then as you progress and you develop a little bit more and you learn, oh my gosh, this has a much bigger impact, right? Then it may push forward, right? So an example of that, which, you know, hopefully we don't all smirk at, is Viagra, right? Originally came on as a blood pressure medication. It was a side effect that caused that to be innovative, right? And so, but they figured that out and they marketed it, and there was clearly a market need. So, we can do the examples in pharma, we can do the examples in medical device. It just happens that most people are very familiar because of our marketing and advertising of pharmaceuticals. And so it's an easier example to throw out.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. I think those are really great examples, really to illustrate the difference. Want to go back a little bit more to the patient considerations and impacts that we talked about earlier in this hour. We've had a few questions related to that area, advice for entrants on how to incorporate patient perspective into their plans for the patient. Jeff and Vineet, I'll go back to you on that in a second, but wanted to ask Mark and Ben if you have any advice on anything specific to this competition about incorporating the patient perspective. Mark, I can hand it over
Ben,
to you.
did you want to start, or yeah, it's very important. I mean, this is, there's a couple of potential users of an artificial kidney, includes a clinician, but includes a patient, also includes their caregivers. When you're talking from a quality of life perspective, there comes kind of inherent benefits that patients are looking for. But it is in context of kind of their whole kind of kidney care spectrum. And so it's really important to see, I think kind of links a little bit to the discussion before, are we just pushing there's room, and there's always a balance of pushing a technology because there's really, new innovations that are coming in this space, and really try and push to an application. It's also really important to kind of go the opposite side, coming from the other angle of understanding who is that user, why would they do this, and what are the inherent benefits that they would get from it. And it's good to align to that. Not every person living with kidney disease wants an artificial kidney, nor do they need one. And it's really important to understand who would want it and why, and then incorporate that in both your design as well as kind of the inherent benefits, and also address, if there are any risks from them, not being, if they're actually having a wearable or implantable kidney, they won't be going twice a week into a dialysis facility. Sometimes there's a risk of not being in that constant care. And so it's really important to understand where the patients are willing to really take advantage of the benefits, but also understand, what are their concerns, and that should kind of inform your design and your approach. But Ben, I'd love, if you have any additional thoughts.
Yeah, thanks. It's a pleasure to be representing HHS and OASH on this webinar. I think it's really, really important to have a full spectrum of understanding of who the customer and end user is. Too often my training is in biomedical engineering, which is a great thing. I love being an engineer and designing and building things. But all too often, I think we assume that a patient is this monolithic entity who's going to use an item or desire it in some way, shape, or form. But it's not really until we talk to patients, caregivers, the doctors, the nurses, to really understand how in this case, an artificial kidney or other technology might change. It really gets back to the question that was asked about invention versus innovation. Innovation is really, is it going to be used? Is this going to change how medicine is practiced? And you can get there through a push type incentive. If you have the marketing of a large multinational pharmaceutical company behind you, then you can create the market that's needed, like Jeff was saying. But in this field, I think you also need the pull incentive. You need the patients to really desire what's there and create that narrative for bringing your product forward.
Thanks, Ben. In the interest of time, we only have 5 minutes left. I want to just sneak in one last question for Vineet and Jeff. A lot of our solvers are likely pretty familiar with traditional processes like grants or contracts, especially those in the academic space. And then, they may be entering their first prize competition. And so given all the differences, wanted to know if there's any advice that they prepare to submit specifically, especially those in the academic spin-off area. I think Vineet, maybe you would have some insights given your tech transfer backgrounds, and then I can hand it over to Jeff.
Would you just summarize the question for me again? I was
sorry.
typing.
Just asking about, there are different considerations between, grants and maybe a prize competition or a contract, or what academic spin out people can be thinking of at this time.
Yeah, I mean, look, roughly there are two buckets of money. There's non-dilutive funding, such as grants and prizes, and then there's dilutive funding, which is, generally what investors will want, some equity in your company. They're both valuable. And look, in the end, you need money in order to progress your science to the market. How you get that money, it doesn't matter. I do like, it's funny, an old colleague, Peter Diamandis, is in the news because he was a super spreader in LA. But when Peter was starting off here in Cambridge, when he came out of MIT, we were all part of a small aerospace community here. And then he went on to do the X Prize. And I think the X Prize has been a phenomenal, a phenomenal idea. Very different than, I like to say there's beauty contests, right? In a way, that's what venture capitalists are, it's a beauty contest when you're, applying for money to venture capitalists, because you have your own idea. And then I love this idea of the X Prize, where it's one idea that a lot of people are competing to work on. And in a way, I think KidneyX sort of is more in that ilk. I think it works really well. And it's pretty clear, we've seen even in the X Prize that these teams do collaborate with each other. Yes, it's competitive, but at the same time, they are sort of, building the shoulders that other people are standing on, right? As Jeff said. So, listen, in the end, you have to get money. Find any which way you can get it.
I think those are wise words to part on. Jeff, anything to add?
Yeah. So my experience is make sure that you can support in whatever claims that you have or whatever ideas that you have, that you create a pathway to support the story that you were telling, right? So there are individuals in the world that are very skilled storytellers. There are others that are very skilled designers. My experience, and I have not obviously applied to this, right? So I'm just assuming that it's going to transfer, is if you have a science, if you have an idea, whether it's a back of a napkin or you've already created a prototype, as you go through and you put an application in, not just saying what it is, but or how that works, but telling the entire story, and then having those supportive documents, right? So those references at the bottom of the page are just as important as the context that you put them in the words of the document, right? So if you have 150 documented reports on glomerular filtration rate, as an example, and you say that you can enhance it and you tell the story of how it is, you're going to get a lot of people's attention because the due diligence has been done to get the support. So I think this is a great project. I want to just add one thing, because we talked about the patients earlier, and I always think you should start with an end there. I do think it's important to realize why it's so complex, right? So the patient is the end user, right? But the patient, whether through taxes or through occupation, has been paying for an insurance company. The insurance company ultimately makes the rules on who gets what, and the provider is the only one that can go in. So even though the patient is the end user, they have very, very little control of what actually impacts or helps in their own health, right? They need two channels to agree in the end, to communicate and agree that this is the pathway that's in my best health and best interest. So absolutely, you have to have the patients involved. Without the patients, no one is going to agree. A doctor's not going to move forward, and an insurance company isn't going to move forward. But if you can't tell the story in a way that's meaningful to all sides, you will lose a chunk of whatever you're asking for in some manner. So keep the patient involved, because they are always the end. It also keeps you humble, right? When you remember that you're doing something good, it keeps you motivated when you trip, and you're going to trip, right? It keeps you motivated to get that cup of coffee, get up in the morning and hit it again. And I think that's an important aspect. But going back to the question, as you file, make sure you support, right? So put the literature in, put the ideas in, put the concepts in. That's number one. Number two, we started this by talking about R&D, regulatory funding, and intellectual property. Please, please, please cite intellectual property, whether you've already filed, whether you've already received, whatever that is. As you're writing up, you can put on the bottom of any application, confidential, patent pending, whatever that is, but make sure that you also protect yourself.
Yeah, I think those are great, really great words of advice. And thank you both so much for joining us today. I think you really hit at some of the strong core values of KidneyX, whether it's collaboration or keeping patients and all the different types of patients really center in innovation. So Jeff and Vineet, really appreciate you joining us today. And to those who are still on the line, also thank you so much for participating in the third and final phase 1 KidneyX AKP webinar. We know we didn't get to all of your questions, but we will be updating our FAQ page with all the questions that you asked in the Q&A section. So we'll send out a reminder when that goes live, but I really appreciate you all joining us today. And with that, I will sign us all off. But again, thank you all for joining, both panelists and attendees.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Good luck.